All right. Thank you everyone for being here today. Welcome. We are very excited to have you join us today for the webinar. My name is Heather Yoakum, and I am the stakeholder lead at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I'm co-hosting this webinar with Imtiaz Ringwala, who's our climate science lead. So we are the NC CASC, which is based at the University of Colorado-Boulder. And we bring you these monthly webinars to facilitate discussion of science and research and best practices that are related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with a focus on the north central region of the US. And for us, that encompasses the Missouri River and upper Colorado River basins. Before I introduce our speaker for today, just a couple notes on general housekeeping and how we run these webinars. We are recording. And you can find all of our webinar recordings and related speaker materials on our website, and we'll post those links shortly. It usually takes us about 24 hours to get the newest webinars up. And so during the webinar, we'll keep all of the participants on mute, but you will have the ability to unmute during the question and answer period at the end of the presentation. And then you're welcome to submit any questions or comments that you have through the chat box during the presentation. And we'll be monitoring the chat box, and we'll make sure that we pose those questions to the presenter at the end during the Q&A. So now I am extremely delighted to introduce Dr. Jennifer Balch, who is our speaker for today. Dr. Jennifer Balch is the University Director of the NC CASC, and she's also the Director of Earth Lab at the University of Colorado-Boulder. She is an Associate Professor in the Department of Geography. Dr. Balch's research aims to understand the patterns and processes that underlie disturbance in ecosystem recovery, particularly how people are shifting fire regimes and those consequences. Her work spans from temperate regions to the tropics and explores how three major ingredients of fire, climate, fuels, and ignitions, are all changing. She has conducted research in the field of fire ecology for nearly 20 years and has lit a few experimental burns to understand the consequences of altered fire regimes. So Jennifer, thank you again very much for being here with us today. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much for that lovely introduction and also overview of NC CASC and what we're up to here. Yeah, and I just want to invite audience participants to use the chat box to ask questions or throw out thoughts as we go along, and we'll try and address questions at the end. And then I also have a few questions for the folks who are on the line as well in terms of what are the key fire science needs that you all are seeing. So I'm going to give an overview of how fire regimes are changing in the Western US. What are the causes of those changes, and what are some of the consequences, and kind of end with a question about what can we expect in the future, and what are some of the key management challenges that we should expect over the shorter term. And this is top of mind for everyone. Next slide, please, Heather. Particularly because we had such a remarkable fire season in 2020. We saw over 10.1 million acres that burned across the Western US. It was an extreme endpoint, and it was consistent with trends. So we saw some of the driest and hottest temperatures recorded in combination across large portions of the Western US. This image on the left is from John Abotsoglu, who's a fire climatologist. One of the key metrics for understanding fire behavior is called vapor pressure deficit, which I'll return to at the end, but it's a combo of temperature and relative humidity. It essentially tells us how hot and dry it is combined. And some of the highest vapor pressure deficits were recorded across large portions of the Western US over the past summer. And what we know in terms of how is this connected to our changing climate, we know that fuel dryness or aridity is changing, and that's what is shown on the right-hand side, which is a metric of how dry our fuels are as a function of temperature and also humidity levels. And we can directly relate that to burned area. And what this image is showing is over the decades, starting in the 1980s, we've seen a substantial increase in burned area that's directly related to temperature increase. And the red dots are the latter decades, starting in the 2000s, and the blue dots are the 1980s and 1990s. And we know that there's actually been a doubling of forest area that has burned in the Western US, which is linked to that increase in how dry fuels actually are. Next slide, please. This is an image that my group derived of the fire perimeters from 2020. This is essentially hot off the presses. We just pulled this data together based on MODIS, which has 2 satellite platforms, and we linked burned area data to perimeters to outline where we saw fires in 2020. And it's colored based on vegetation type. So what's remarkable here is there's a lot of area that has burned in the Western US. Some of this is also cropland intentional burns in the kind of darker red colors. So we're not making that distinction here, but we are showing kind of the major vegetation type within each of the fires that happened in the Western US. And what's also notable here is you've got large vegetation fires happening across many different types of ecosystems in the Western US in 2020. And again, in terms of the fire area or the burned area in wildfires, the National Interagency Fire Center documented that's about 10.1 million acres that burned. That's the second largest fire season in terms of area burned, going back to the 1980s at least. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about kind of 2 major threads today. One is what is the cause of changing fire regimes? And we'll also go into some of what are the consequences, both for ecosystems and for people. And I love this photograph for a variety of reasons, but it really puts people in their place in terms of the fire cycle. We have altered combustion across the landscape in many different ways. And I'm going to go into how I make the argument that people are the fire species. Next slide, please. So there's 3 key ingredients for fire: climate, fuel, and ignitions. You need a warm and dry climate to burn, you need something to burn, and you need an ignition source. And critically, we are changing all 3 of those. And we've also put a lot in harm's way. Next slide, please. So ingredient number 1, a warm and dry climate. Next slide. So I'll bring it back to Colorado for a minute. So climate change is here and now in Colorado, and what we saw in 2020 were some really critical signals. One, we had really long duration fire events. Cameron Peak Fire, the fires out west in Western Colorado burned for months on end. And we also had really late burning wildfires into October, and fires that actually started in October and then burned several weeks. We pulled together some data in terms of, well, how much area burned in October in Colorado, at least going back to the 2000s. And late burning wildfires in October that start in October and burn in October are pretty rare. So we documented that there were only probably about a dozen or less wildfires that start in October and burn more than 10,000 acres. So that gives us a signal that very dry and very hot summer seasons that push all the way into fall and even later are really a mark of how extended our fire season has become as a function of increasing temperatures. Next slide, please. We also know that fire is very responsive. So a little bit of warming in terms of temperature increase is leading to a lot more burning. So my team also put this figure together, including the 2020 data in terms of burned area in millions of acres in the red bars. And the black line is average temperature over the Western US. And we see this partnership between increased temperatures and increased area burned that's pretty remarkable. And it's highly tied to how much area we see. In fact, the 10 largest fire years in terms of area burned have all happened since the 2000s. Next slide, please. And we also know something about different vegetation types and the climate change signal on wildfires in grassland, shrublands, and forested systems. And it does look like forested systems are more sensitive. So we did a study looking at California in particular, and it does seem that the amount of area that burns in a given summer in forested systems is more linked to warming than, say, in grassland systems. And what might be going on there is grassland systems don't take that much to dry out, and so they may very well be flammable most of the time. And so an increase in temperature may not make them any more flammable than they are in an average year. Now that might change if you look specifically at spring temperatures and fall temperatures and the extension of the fire season. But it is important to recognize and acknowledge that we're seeing different effects of climate change on fires in different vegetation types. Next slide, please. So ingredient number two is fuel. Next slide. So we also know that fuels are changing, and one of the ways that we are significantly changing fuels is through the introduction of invasive grasses. This image here shows the range distribution of different invasive grasses in the ecoregions that they overlap with. And this study that came out in 2019 showed that 8 out of 12 major invasive grasses are doubling or even tripling fire activity compared to native vegetation types. Invasive grasses are highly flammable. They have thin leaves. Some can create a continuous carpet of fuels like cheatgrass, which is an invasive grass. That also remarkably changes fire activity. So we're not only changing the climate, but we're also changing fuels. Next slide, please. Invasive grasses are little arsonists, essentially, because they are so flammable. They can create very large wildfires. The image on the left is an image of cheatgrass, which is in the lighter yellow colors, and interspersed are sagebrush plants that are, in an uninvaded system. These sagebrush ecosystems have quite a bit of area that's essentially bare ground between plants. That makes it actually very hard for fire to progress. And so when you have cheatgrass move in, you create this continuous carpet of fuel that makes it very easy for that system to burn. And in fact, some of the largest fire events in the Western US, invasive grasses are implicated in those events because they can create this continuous fuel bed structure. So one example would be probably a fire that many of you have never heard of, but it's the Martin Fire in Nevada. Burned over 400,000 acres in the span of a few days as a function of high wind conditions and also invasive grasses that were facilitating that fire. Next slide, please. So ingredient number 3, a spark. Next slide. So it's also important to acknowledge where our ignition source is coming from. There's 2 major buckets. One is lightning ignitions, which is the natural cause of wildfires. And then there's people. This image is showing the percent of human-related ignitions of our wildfires over a roughly 2-decade period. The redder the colors, the more human ignitions, and the bluer the color, the more lightning ignition. And what this is showing is essentially you've got a really strong signal of people providing ignitions for the vast majority of our wildfires. So 84% across the US were started by people in this roughly 2-decade period. The mountain regions, which are still magnets for lightning, still hold on to lightning as a major ignition source. In Colorado, for example, more than 70% of our wildfires are started by lightning, but 30% are started by people. So it varies depending on where you are. But what you also see is there's major distributions of ignition sources in the Central Valley and the coasts of California, Oregon, and Washington, and also the Great Plains and Southeast are also marked by significant human-related ignitions. Next slide, please. And if you look at this distribution of ignitions across the year, so the Julian day 1 is January 1st, and it goes out to 365, which is December 31st. And this is just a plot across that same time period of 20 plus years, the number of fires that happened on a given day. And what you can see here is that there's a huge signal of human-related ignitions throughout the year. And in blue are the lightning ignitions that are really constrained to a summertime signal related to when you get the type of storms that bring lightning. The peak in the middle, many of you can probably guess, but that's July 4th. That's a single day of the year where we start the most wildfires. That's 7,000 events over that 2-decade period that were started on July 4th. So what this means and why this is important is because if people are providing ignitions throughout the year and climate change is making the window of opportunity longer, we've got an interaction between what people are doing and how climate is changing that essentially can make our fire seasons more challenging. Next slide, please. So consequences, next slide. If you wouldn't mind going back 1 or 2. Thank you. And just a little bit of context or theory here. So when we think about consequences and when we talk about megafires or extreme events, we've also thought about how we contextualize that, both in terms of the environmental drivers and responses and also the social drivers and responses. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, we define megafires not necessarily because of their size, but also because of their impacts. And that, I think, is a critical distinction we need to make. And that's essentially what this complicated set of arrows is just trying to say, that when we talk about extremes or we talk about megafires, we should also really be considering, why do they matter? Do they matter because of ecosystems that can't recover? Do they matter because homes are destroyed and those fires are happening where people live? So these are the types of questions that I think are nuanced, but incredibly important so that we can better understand what are the fires that actually matter to us. Next slide, please. And I'll also describe some of the information and the data types that we're also using to explore how fires are changing. This image I put in here just to show that our science can be really, really informative. In fact, we had estimated the likelihood of a 1 million acre fire event in 2019. This came from a paper that we published. On the right-hand side is the somewhat complicated, but all you need to know is the lines aren't zero there. They fluctuate. They're non-zero probabilities of a 1 million acre fire event that we documented going back to the 1990s using Landsat-based fire-derived perimeters and estimating what the current climate situation was and whether or not the current climate situation would support a 1 million acre fire event in the lower 48. And the answer in 2019 was yes, we were actually living with the probability of a 1 million acre fire event. And then 2020 happened, and the August complex became, nicknamed the gigafire because it peaked past 1 million acres. And all of the red dots on the plot in the left are essentially showing the fire events from 2020 plotted against what the fire size distribution was for all the events going back to 1984. So what this is telling us is like, wow, we had an extreme fire year in terms of the size of events. And we knew that we were living with that chance. Next slide, please. So some of the data that we use to look at how fires are changing, we use a combination of government records and satellite-based detections. On the left is an example of a product that we developed, essentially perimeters around burned area pixels that come from the MODIS dual sensor system. And then the progression of that fire event. We can explore how, for example, the rim fire moved based on the day of the year that it was detected as burned. And then we can also match that to understand how that fire is spreading, what the spread rate is of that event, the burned area, the cost of that event, how many personnel were associated with the fire suppression efforts, how many structures were threatened, how many structures were destroyed. We've also put together our own version of the ICS 209 data, which is 120,000 incident command reports that are required on a daily basis for any event, any fire event that receives some sort of suppression response team. That captures only 2% of the wildfires, but it's 80% of the burned area and suppression costs. So we're able to get a really fine-grained understanding of fire, not only fire behavior, but also the societal impacts and suppression costs associated with different fire events to also understand how that might be changing. Next slide, please. We also utilize novel sources of data like Zillow Records, for example. So the information you get on your phone app from Zillow about any individual home. We have a partnership with Zillow to access over 200 million housing records to understand how the wildland-urban interface is changing through time. And this gives kind of two examples of that. From the Gatlinburg fire, Chimney Tops fire, and also Waldo Canyon and Black Forest fires that are outlined in perimeters. And then we can look at the progression of development and settlement patterns over time through that partnership with Zillow. So those are some of the types of information we're using to better understand changing fire and consequences. Next slide, please. So people and homes, next slide. We know that we've put a lot in harm's way, and it's increasing in terms of the number of homes we've put in harm's way. So this slide is showing the size of the dot is related to the number of homes that are threatened, and the ignition source is also indicated in red for human-related ignitions and more in blue for the proportion that are still lightning ignition related. And no matter where you are at in terms of wildland urban interface, urban area, over 96% of the fires that threaten homes are started by people. So we're kind of our own worst enemies in terms of we start a lot of fires and we also happen to start those fires where people live. Over the course of roughly 2 decades, we mapped where every fire was and every home, and essentially 1 million homes were within wildfire perimeters over that 2-decade period going up to 2015, and another 59 million were within 1 kilometer cumulatively over that period of time. So there's a lot at risk. Next slide, please. Ecosystem consequences, next slide. So we also know that severity is increasing in terms of the area that burned between 1985 and 2017, that burned in high severity patches has also increased. And that is related also to this metric of vapor pressure deficit, which is a combo of temperature and humidity. And it's increased for forested areas. So what this kind of somewhat complicated figure is showing, but is that the western, northern, and southwest regions, the green, purple, and orange areas, have seen that increase in area burned by high severity fires going back to the 1980s. And in some, it's an 8-fold increase across the forested systems. There is no noted trend for the California coast. And this might be consistent with the previous work that I showed around forested systems being more vulnerable to the increase in temperature and how that impacts fire behavior. Next slide, please. And it's also been documented that we're seeing recruitment limitation in post-fire landscapes as well. Kim Davis, who partners with the NC CASC and is continuing some work related to post-fire recruitment, has documented that there's an expectation of a decline in recruitment probabilities. This is for ponderosa pine systems based on a recruitment index that captures several different variables related to climate, but also proximity to seed source. That the expectation is that recruitment of ponderosa pine in its current range will decline in the future under a warming climate. Next slide, please. And then there's a big question about, well, what does future fire look like? This comes from a paper that explored this question for the Southern Rockies ecoregion under 2 different emissions scenarios, looking at several different models from different science groups around the world. And there is an expectation, and this is again a forested system, that the burned area will be responsive for the next several decades, going out to 2070 in terms of an increase in burned area. So we are expecting more fire seasons like 2020, particularly in our forested systems. And this is a big question, and this is something that we hope to dig into a little bit more, including by some work that one of our own postdocs is going to be working on, Jill Marie Stevens. Next slide, please. So what are some of the solutions? I mean, I think this is a vexing problem that's going to take exploration across many different fronts and also many different partners, and how we come up with and move towards pathways that allow us to live more sustainably with increasing fire. But here are some of them. And this comes from an opinion piece I wrote for the conversation. Building better, we can really think hard about how we develop into flammable landscapes. Emphasizing backyard management and priority habitats. There's been a lot of conversation, especially in the last year, around forest management, the role of forest management, and what are the solutions that we can get to via better forest management. But that's not the only challenge that we have. Bringing Smokey Bear to the suburbs, we've got a serious ignition problem related to people's activities. Some of the national parks and national forests here in Colorado shut down as a function of expected high wind conditions, both to potentially reduce the ignitions from people, but also to limit the vulnerability related to, wow, what if we have to evacuate people from our public lands? Using fire to fight fire, native burning is a model. There are many challenges associated with doing prescribed burns, but there are lots of lessons to be learned by how Native American communities continue to cultivate fire in their land management as a tool and as a mechanism to maintain and preserve sustainable ecosystems. We need to figure out who's most vulnerable, whose lungs are in the way and whose homes are in the way. There were tens of millions of people that suffered the consequences of smoke this past summer. And I think we got a real taste of what our future may look like in terms of the smoke from wildfires and how we may have to deal with that. And lastly, we need to understand where we're going and where we're headed with future fire. And there's lots of work that needs to be done there, and we're hoping that we can pick off some of that. And I've kind of starred the ones that I think the CASCs can really play an important role in helping us better understand and reach some solutions. Next slide, please. So some of the work that the NC CASC is doing and has planned are related to some of these topic areas. So we are planning to look at projecting future warming and the changes to fire regimes for our north central region, particularly better understanding of extreme events. We've done some work already looking at the likelihood of extremes under the observed record, and we want to better understand how that may change in the future. We also have some work being done by Kim Davis and Phil Higuera at University of Montana, one of our key consortium members, looking at post-fire recovery and the potential for fire-initiated transformation. They've done some great work and are working with our stakeholder groups to better understand and help identify where it makes sense to facilitate future restoration. Honoring traditional burning practices and partnering to help identify where prescribed burning is an appropriate mitigation strategy. Our co-PI, James Rattlingleaf, and Stefan Tangent, our BIA tribal liaison, are also helping us understand what are the key needs and priorities for our tribal resource managers on this front too. And this is more of an emerging theme and conversation, but we're super open to partnering with other folks on this. And lastly, I'll mention that there's a larger national CASC effort across many of our regions to better understand future fire and the key needs of our larger stakeholder community at a national scale around changing fire and changing fire regimes. Next slide, please. All right, so that's all I have for you all today in terms of content, but I did want to leave some time for questions that I can ask. And then I have 3 questions for you all that I hope we can get to as well.
Great. So Jennifer, you're ready for Q&A, or did you want to ask your questions really quickly?
I'm open. You tell me what you would prefer.
Why don't you go ahead and put your questions up, or I can put your questions up, and then maybe that can be a way to people can think about it for a moment, and then we can kind of jump into the Q&A after that. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. Would you mind presenting, and they're in order, so like the next slide was the first question. And then I'll quickly answer the one that I see in the chat box too from Mitch Eaton. So the ignition data, so we excluded prescribed intentional burns from that figure. We only looked at fires that were considered wildfires that required some sort of suppression response. Okay, so I would love to get a sense from you all of what are some of the most urgent fire-related challenges you face in your job? And if you're coming from it more from a management context, I'd love to hear that. Or if you're coming more from a science context, it may be something that you're seeing in terms of the patterns and processes that we're facing. So if you all wouldn't mind either typing your comments in the chat box, or if you want to just jump right in to the conversation, I'd appreciate anyone's thoughts or feedback on this question. Yeah, that's a great one, Michael Remke. Thank you. So learning how to cultivate a community that understands and can live with mixed severity fire in wetter forest types that do not have a historical frequent fire regime. And that's also one thing that's notable about 2020 is that we had wildfires in more historically wet systems. And that has been extremely challenging to understand and process. And thank you, Dominique Bachelet, for your comment too. The way media talk about catastrophic once in a lifetime fire events and the education around living with fire because it's an inevitability in the future. Yeah, that's a huge challenge. How do we talk about extremes, which tend to be somewhat rare events, and how do we prepare for them? Coming from the Forest Service, Mark Bellis, the capacity to fight fires seems extremely overwhelming. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I would say we're asking too much of our firefighting community. We have so much at risk, and the expectation is that every home is going to be saved. And that's super, super challenging. Dennis Longknife, thank you for your comment too. Our tribe is doing a thinning project on 100 acres to open up the canopy, increase sunlight, and increase native plant growth and vigor, to also increase soil health and reduce wildfire potential. Yeah, that's a great example of some of the efforts that we could learn from at larger scales to try and figure out how we can implement them. Yeah, did anyone want to make a comment about some of those ideas or thoughts that you all put forward? Okay, and I know it's kind of a weird thing to put yourself in.
Thomas Timmerlin is raising his hand, so go ahead, Thomas. I'm having problems hearing you. There's a little bit of a delay. Maybe try turning off your video and see if that helps the sound. Yeah, I'm still not hearing you. If you want to type into the chat, that would be fine. And MTS, let me tell you, I cannot keep my screen in presentation mode and also see the chat. Every time I try to go out, it kicks it back to the regular mode. So I'm going to have to turn the Q&A over to you, MTS.
Sure, no problem.
And I'll just briefly summarize a couple more comments that are coming through. So the focus on vegetation management versus thinking about fire-wise structures, I think this is critical. I think we've put so much emphasis on wildland fuels, but we don't have as much understanding about urban fuels and urban structures. And some of the imagery that came from Paradise, California, and other fires shows entire neighborhoods that have burned to the ground, but the trees around them are still standing. And that to me signals that we need to better understand the articulation of fuels between wildland and urban landscapes. And thank you also, so that was from Michael Rumke, another comment from John Gross around understanding the current science and distilling messages. This webinar is a big help, thank you. And we can always do better about translating our science too. So if there are key needs, yeah, we'll get to that question actually. Yeah, so the question about fireworks bans, do they work? That's an excellent question, and I don't have the answer to that. All I know is that there are a ton of fireworks related events that start on July 4th. The question about like, would firework bans work in certain places? We don't know the answer to that. We also see clustering of fires too, based on which states do and do not allow fireworks, which may imply that some of those bans are effective. But that's a great question to continue to explore. Okay, next question, Heather, if you wouldn't mind going to the next one.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, so this is a question that one of you kind of pointed to already, but what do you consider the most pressing fire science needs? Like if you had an opportunity to tell us, you know, gosh, we really need this bit of science, or we really need to answer this question and we don't have a good answer, what would it be? Or are we all done? Do we not need to do any more science? Yeah, and you don't have to be in the chat box too if you just want to throw down some ideas in the conversation space. You're more than welcome to jump into this black boxy void with me. I thank you, Jim, for your question there too. Yeah, what are the thresholds for impacts, particularly air pollution impacts? That's a great one. Yeah, any other key answers or questions you all have about how fire might be changing for your particular use case or study area? Yeah, that's another great question. Near-term VPD or vapor pressure deficit, which is that combo of temperature and humidity. Knowing the best season to implement prescribed fires, depending on the vegetation type and mix of native and non-native species assemblages. Yeah, that's a great question too. How do we educate communities that live in fire-prone areas and are carrying some risk? A question about ponderosa pine regeneration and how that might respond, how individuals might respond to mechanical treatment or fire or both. It's a great question too. All right, thank you all. We'll move to the next question, Heather, if you don't mind. Okay, this might be a science question too, but for you all who may be dealing with kind of the management needs around particular forest systems or national parks, where do you see potential to create more fire resilient landscapes? Have you seen success already in strategies you've implemented, either field treatments or plantings? Or if you're someone who thinks at larger spatial scales across regions or states, are there kind of critical areas or reasons why you would want to choose one place over another? Thank you, Dennis. So since our little Rocky Mountains are surrounded by prairie, the greatest risks to our tribal communities, we're vulnerable to our wildfires, drought, and pathogen attacks. Yeah, thank you, Dennis, for that. Yeah, and comments about priority habitat. Yeah, I think this question is related to that. And I think it's open, kind of hoping that others will help us define that. Because here's the rub, and I'll give you some data that we published a few years ago. Tanya Schonagel led this effort. We looked at the number of field treatments that experienced a wildfire, and it was less than 2%. Over a roughly decade period. And so what that says is, wow, it's a lot of effort to do field treatment and it's very expensive. So we can't possibly do it everywhere. So the question then becomes, where should we do field treatments and how should we prioritize those resources? Because it becomes a Sisyphean task to try and implement field treatments across all of our public lands and all of our systems that have been left with a fire deficit. So that's really kind of where that question is coming from, and that comment about priority habitat. And then thank you, Michael Remke, too, for your comment. Anywhere we have communities in fire-prone ecologies is an opportunity to create fire-resilient landscapes. Say this because fire is a threat to diverse human values. Thus, where humans live becomes an opportunity to manifest a more habitable landscape. Yeah, that's a great comment. And I'll also add that some of our work shows that area, and other folks who work on the wildland urban interface, that area is increasing over time. And so we have more and more communities that are living in flammable vegetation. And so we need to figure out how we can scale this idea of fire resilience across systems. Okay, so with that, I'll ask you all if you have any questions for me or the folks on my team who are also on the call as well.
MTS, do you want to start going through some of the questions that you've been fielding?
I think Jennifer has done well in going through all the questions. So
right.
I think folks can, if they want, they can unmute themselves and ask questions. And Jennifer, there's one comment by Thomas down there. I guess you got to see that. Talks about the need for downscale data that's available at local scales.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if I'm assuming many of you are connected to Colorado in some way, given that you're aware of the NC CASC. But yes, that lower number in Colorado of 30% human-related ignitions versus 70% that are still lightning ignition is important. It definitely indicates different strategies. But I will also say that 30% of human-related ignitions that start wildfires in Colorado, it's also where the risk is highest. So we see a lot of human-started wildfires along the Front Range, along road networks. And so a lot of those lightning fires that start in the mountains, many of them aren't near places that are as vulnerable or exposed. So that it's important context, and that varies a lot by state. So California, it's actually much higher than 84%. And part of the reason why that is, west of the Sierras, there's virtually no lightning naturally. It's all very concentrated in the Sierras and then eastward of that. So most of the wildfires that are problematic in California are started by people as a function of the climatology of lightning. So yeah, that's a great question or comment. Any other questions? Yeah, that's a great question, Roberto. Thank you. So the question is, have different fire suppression strategies and tactics been studied at a large scale? If so, have some been proven to be more effective overall in specific fuel types? That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to that. I do know that the U.S. Forest Service puts out over 90%, at least that's what they claim. And what has been studied around that is, well, what kinds of fires are we left with? And it's the more extreme ones. So that's also, depending on how you look at it, that's success, or that might actually be problematic, because what we're doing is we're putting out the small to medium, moderate burning fires that actually do some good work in the landscape. And so what we're left with is these extreme fires that are hard to control. But that's a great question. If I can ask some colleagues and try and follow up with you about that. Yeah, any other questions? Okay, so from John Gross, what do you think are the most critical fire science questions for natural resource managers in the Rocky Mountain region? Yeah, I think a big one is around future fire projections. I think that's part of what's motivating us to move in that direction, is trying to understand, can we predict out on some decadal timescales what's going to happen across Western forest systems. One other thing that one of our colleagues is working on, Phil Higuera and others at University of Montana, is what's the historical context for the 2020 fire season, particularly and specifically in Rocky Mountain National Park, where he and his team have looked at historical records through tree rings to reconstruct what the fire frequencies and patterns have been over the last 2,000 years. And it looks like 2020 was well outside the historical range of variability. So what that means is we're moving into a fire regime that we haven't seen potentially in a very long time. And so we need to understand two things there. One, what is future fire going to bring us? And then how are existing ecosystems going to respond? And so I think another critical question for scientists to answer is, where would we expect vegetation transitions to happen as a function of the fast change that can happen when you have climate change setting the backdrop and fire precipitating major transformation? Okay, I'm not totally keeping up with the questions. I think the next one is related to, for example. Any thoughts on how to identify surprising events when you're working off of big data sets? Yeah, this is, yes, I do have some thoughts about this. And I would point you to one of our papers, actually, by Max Joseph et al., looking at extremes and the ability to understand extreme fire behavior. I can send that to you, or I can also follow up too. There's a lot of really great theory around extremes and how do you predict them? How do you understand them when they're kind of rare events? So I think that provides a framework to start from. I'll move on to the next question because that could take me an hour to get into extreme value theory. Can you address the problem with thinning, opening canopies, and increasing the drying of fine fuels in high elevation and wet cool forests where fuel was never limiting, as opposed to low elevation dry forests? Yeah, this is a good question. So this challenge, I think if I understand your question right, Dominique, you're asking about the challenge of the drying of fuels in the understory versus wanting to thin trees because you then limit the progression of fire through the canopy. Is that kind of where you're going with that? Okay. Yeah, there's trade-offs here in terms of how forest systems are managed. But I mean, we do know that fire progression needs continuity of fuels as well. So I think there's, the question of, do you want to keep the fire in a low to moderate severity, low surface burning mode, or a canopy burning mode? And I think the question of thinning canopies is probably advantageous if you want to try and maintain surface burning regimes, because we know that the progression is totally dependent on that continuity of fuels. That would be my short answer, but I would love to talk to you more about that question. A question from Dennis Longknife: talking to our tribal college students about climate and fire can give them an opportunity to create fire resilience landscape, since they are our future leaders. Yes, absolutely. That is such a great point. And we need to do everything we can to support students from tribal nations who want to make this kind of difference in the world. So thank you for that. And I will also use that as a moment to mention one great program that we have started here at CU Boulder, which is the Tribal Climate Leaders Program, that many of the folks on our team have helped to build. And then we have 5 wonderful students who have joined that program, who are making a difference in some of these ways, not necessarily related to fire, but related to climate-related challenges. And I do hope that this opportunity for them will help them along their pathway to be current future leaders and future leaders. All right, thank you all. Given that, if there are no more questions, it sounds like the questions are kind of petering out a little bit. I might suggest that we end a little early because I know everybody has back-to-back Zoom situations, and you may need a short break. So thank you all for your time and your questions and your engagement too through the chat. I appreciate it. And I will follow up with Dominique and Thomas and some others as well about some of their questions. So thank you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you much, Jennifer, and thank you very much, everyone.